Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into a world where true crime stories honestly feel like wild, completely unbelievable movie scripts. Human elements like lies, aliases, shifting narratives, they create this incredibly dense fog that can literally obscure reality for decades. But, as we're going to see today, objective science always anchors us back to the truth. Let's get right into it. So here's the roadmap for what we're covering today. First, unraveling unbelievable true crime. Second, the Sharon Marshall mystery. Third, the tragedy of little Gregory. Fourth, the Texas imposter. And finally, number 5, why the details matter. We're going to look at exactly how biological evidence and chronological logic have totally shattered massive webs of deception. All right, Section 1, unraveling unbelievable true crime and the undeniable power of forensics. Let's set up some basic ground rules for how investigators cut through human lies by relying on hard, objective facts. Okay, so this perfectly captures the core battle in literally any complex criminal investigation. Human testimony, it's inherently flawed. People can lie, they can spin these incredibly complex narratives, forge identities, and completely manipulate the people around them. But biological evidence, like DNA and strict timelines, those are objective, unyielding, and totally definitive. They don't have an agenda. When someone's story just doesn't match the physical impossibilities of a timeline or the absolute certainty of a DNA marker, the whole facade crumbles. This dynamic right here is the ultimate roadmap to figuring out what actually happened. Moving into Section 2, the Sharon Marshall mystery, decades of deception. We're going to look at the unbelievable tragedy of Sharon Marshall and the man who orchestrated those decades of deception, Frank Floyd. Just take a look at this timeline, because it really demonstrates the sheer absurdity of Frank Floyd's shifting identities and horrific alibis. Okay, so in 1962, he's convicted of abduction and escapes a mental hospital. By the 1970s, he's using an alias, marries a woman named Sandy, and literally steals her children while she's in jail. Fast forward to 1989, and he actually marries a woman named Sharon, who, spoiler alert, is later revealed to be one of those stolen children. It's awful. In 1990, Sharon dies in a highly suspicious hit and run. And then in 1994, he casually walks into an elementary school and kidnaps Sharon's young son, Michael. I mean, this timeline is pure chaos. It's totally dictated by a man controlling the narrative through lies and aliases. But eventually science caught up to him. Frank swore up and down he was the biological father to little Michael. But when Michael resisted visiting him in prison, a DNA test was ordered. And guess what? That DNA definitively proved Frank was lying. He was absolutely not the father. But the revelations didn't stop there. Forensic DNA testing eventually uncovered the most shocking truth of all. The woman he called Sharon, his supposed wife, was genetically proven to be Suzanne Marie Severgues, his own kidnapped stepdaughter from the 1970s. And the craziest part? The only reason this whole thing began to unravel was because Frank tried to claim an $80,000 life insurance policy on Sharon. To get the money, the system forced him to use his real Social Security number, perfectly aligning his true identity with his massive criminal past. Now here's where it gets even more incredible. Forensics isn't just about DNA in a test tube. It relies on overlapping timelines and physical markers too. In 1995, skeletal remains with a gunshot wound were found down in Florida. Later that exact same year, a mechanic in Kansas bought a truck at auction and found 97 horrifying photographs hidden inside. Investigators looked at the timeline of that truck and realized Frank Floyd had actually stolen and abandoned it in 1994. By comparing the photos in the truck to the unidentified remains, forensic experts matched a very specific cheekbone wound on a woman in the photographs perfectly to a wound on the recovered skull. That objective forensic match identified the remains as Cheryl Camesso, a former friend of Sharon's, and ultimately put Frank Floyd on death row. Okay, Section 3, the tragedy of little Gregory, when forensics hit a wall. We really need to understand what happens when forensic science faces extreme frustration and investigative dead ends. We need to analyze the chronology here because the timeline of October 16, 1984 in France is absolutely chilling. In the afternoon, 4-year-old Gregory Villemin disappears from his front yard. That very evening, an anonymous caller claims they strangled the boy and threw him in the river, which tragically turned out to be true. But look at the next day. A letter arrives from an anonymous tormentor known as the Crow. The absolute critical timeline detail here is the postmark on that letter. It was stamped at the exact time of the abduction. This chronological alignment proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a highly premeditated act of revenge, meticulously planned down to the minute. But here is where this tragedy just compounds. Despite that perfect timeline pointing straight to premeditation, the biology totally failed to yield answers. Investigators relentlessly tested the physical evidence. They tested clothing fibers, they analyzed the ropes used to bind the child, and they even tested the saliva on the postage stamps from those threatening letters, desperate for a DNA profile. Yet, across decades and multiple rounds of advanced testing, the results continually came back inconclusive. But science is always evolving, right? When traditional DNA hits a dead end, investigators have to look for new objective markers. So, in 2020, French police turned to this fascinating new investigative technology called stylometrics. Rather than looking for biological DNA, stylometrics looks for linguistic DNA. It analyzes the specific style, the syntax, the punctuation, and even turns a phrase used in writing to identify an author. By applying this highly objective technological analysis to the threatening letters sent by the crow, authorities were actually able to identify a brand new suspect, bringing fresh hope to a cold case where traditional forensics had totally hit a wall. Which brings us to an interesting question. If DNA can sometimes fail to find a killer, can it at least prove who a victim really is? This is Section 4, the Texas Imposter, the Chameleon Unmasked. I really want you to zero in on this massive red flag right in the middle of this timeline. In June of 1994, 13-year-old Nicholas Barclay vanishes in Texas. Fast forward 3 months to September, and his older brother Jason inexplicably calls the police, claiming Nicholas is actively breaking into their garage. But when police arrive, there's no sign of a break-in and absolutely no sign of Nicholas. Then, miraculously, in 1997, a boy claiming to be Nicholas is found alive in Spain. We have to ask ourselves, in a timeline of a missing person, what is the logical explanation for sibling calling the police 3 months later to report a break-in by the missing child that never actually happened? And it wasn't just the timeline that made zero sense. The physical discrepancies here are just staggering. The real Nicholas Barclay was an American boy with blonde hair and blue eyes. But the teenager brought back from Spain, he had dark hair, brown eyes, and a heavy French accent. I mean, come on. The imposter claimed his captors had performed experiments on him to change his eye and hair color to hide his identity. Amazingly, the family actively ignored these blatant biological impossibilities, even telling investigators to close the case. But as we've been saying, human lies just can't override objective science. A private investigator working alongside a film crew finally noticed the discrepancies. He took photographs of the imposter's ears and compared them to old photos of Nicholas. Now, ears don't change shape as we age, and these photographs proved they were two completely different people. This objective photographic evidence was enough for the FBI to step in and get a court order for mandatory testing. Once again, DNA and fingerprint forensics broke the alibi. The biological markers definitively proved this wasn't a traumatized teenager from Texas. It was a 23-year-old French con artist named Frédéric Bourdin, a man with 500 different identities known as the Chameleon. So this brings us right back to that bizarre timeline anomaly from 1994. Why on earth did the family so willfully accept an imposter who looked literally nothing like their son? Investigators and even the imposter Frédéric Bourdin himself proposed a chilling theory. To quote investigators regarding Jason's delayed phone call about the garage break-in, those types of calls aren't unusual when someone has been murdered, as the murderer often attempts to make it seem like the victim may still be alive. Now, while that is just a theory, it strictly frames the idea that the timeline discrepancy, that delayed 911 call, was a manipulative tactic to cover up a murder within the family, which perfectly explains why they were so eager to accept an imposter and just close the case. Finally, Section 5, Why the Details Matter, the ultimate roadmap to truth. Let's bring all 3 of these astonishing case files together for a brief synthesis. If you take away just one thing from this explainer today, let it be this. Across all these stranger-than-fiction stories, human testimony was constantly flawed, manipulative, or flat-out fabricated. But timelines, they expose the physical impossibilities of those lies. The DNA and biological markers provide definitive, unyielding truth. Objective science is our anchor in the unbelievable chaos. Think about it. It was the DNA that proved Frank Floyd wasn't the father, and the cheekbone match that identified a victim. It was the postmark timeline that proved little Gregory's tragic fate was premeditated. And it was fingerprints, ear matching, and DNA that exposed a French con artist masquerading as a missing Texas boy. So I'll leave you to ponder this final provocative thought. If DNA and precise chronological timelines can dismantle the incredibly elaborate, movie-like lies of these 3 cases we just explored, What other dark secrets are hiding in the cold cases sitting in police filing cabinets right now, just waiting for the exact right scientific test to break them wide open? Thank you so much for joining me to explore the incredible power of true crime forensics. Keep questioning the narrative and keep looking for the objective truth.